I would imagine somehow he ought to have been in this graveyard rather than out there in the stone circle. So why do you think he might have been not buried in the churchyard?
Well, you shouldn't assume that automatically that everyone will be buried in the churchyard. In fact, there's a statute from the Diocese of Salisbury of about 1215 which specifies people who needn't be buried in the churchyard, right. And they include, if I remember correctly, manifest usurers.
So what's that? There's people who lend money.
Money lenders, yes. Excommunicants, and finally strangers to the parish, which is possibly more relevant with us today.
The tools found with the body suggest that he was a travelling tradesman and therefore didn't belong to the parish. The position of the body, not laid out but face down, implies that he was simply rolled into the pit. It indicates that he wasn't buried with much love or respect. He must have been a long way from friends or family.
The fact that he was buried here and not in a village just down the road suggests that also he had no relatives nearby who might have taken him home, so perhaps he was a real stranger to the district.
Yes, I think he's someone who the local people would have regarded in effect as a foreigner, someone from outside the immediate community, someone with no links at all, and someone who had no status and no ties at all with the parish.
So he's buried outside the churchyard and apparently in this pit that is open, ready to take him, but not obviously dug for him because it's got this huge megalith in it. So it raises the bigger question of why the stone itself was being buried.
Well, there seem to be two main reasons. One, that they see the stones as a symbol of paganism of some sort, or secondly, that they're just in the way of agriculture and they want to bury them so they can get on with their farming. But whether those are the real answers, we just don't know at all.
And do we have no written record of this?
Absolutely nothing at all.
If the barber surgeon was indeed an unattached drifter plying his trade from one district to another, could this have had any bearing on the sword wounds to his head?
So the man had a couple of sword wounds on his head. What do you make of those?
Well, my inclination is to think that he suffered them in a battle, because the skeletons excavated at London show that people who'd been in urban brawls are knifed. They're not hit with a sword.
So Anthea thought that the wounds were too small to be from battle, that where she's seen people who've been wounded in battle, they have their heads covered in wounds.
I suspect that's for people who've died. You know,
Right.
they've been hacked to pieces on the ground. But I think this is a man who's possibly been lucky. He's been lightly wounded and managed to get away. I'd see him as a conscript, where the manor or the village has been told to supply a certain quota of people, and they wouldn't necessarily send their better people. That they'd send perhaps an orphan, an undernourished person, someone they could perhaps afford to lose.
So the barber surgeon or tailor could have died in Avebury, but as a stranger to the villagers. His final resting place was most likely a makeshift grave, a hole in the ground that had already been dug for another purpose, the burial of the megalith. Over the last 1,000 years, many of the original 600 standing stones were displaced, leaving only about 100. Some were broken up for building materials, others, like the Barber's stone, were buried during anti-pagan campaigns fostered by the medieval church. The standing stones were potent symbols of pre-Christian paganism. Perhaps a local church ordered their burial. It would have been a job requiring maximum effort. The community would have had to have teamed together to dig huge pits in the ground, then push over rocks into the ground. It seems it was one of these pits that provided a convenient burial place for a stranger who died in the village. But there is still one thing that doesn't fit. Mike cannot understand how the barber surgeon could have been buried beneath the megalith, unless it fell or was pushed on him afterwards. But this would have caused far greater damage to the skeleton than was actually found. By returning to the original archaeological documents and dig diary from 1938, Mike is now able to form a theory. It is based on Anthea's discovery of the broken hip bone, an injury we know happened just before or after death.
Back here in Avebury, looking at the excavation records, I was able to piece the story together, and the fracture on his hip is at the precise point, very clearly described in the excavation diary, where the megalith had pinned his bone to the edge of the chalk pit. And we can see now, looking at the records, that what appears to have happened is the stone was pushed into the pit, and there was a gap beside the megalith, and this man who had already died was just thrown into the pit, apparently no ceremony at all. And then perhaps as the pit was being backfilled, the stone slipped just a little bit and closed that gap and pinned his hip and broke the bone against the edge of the pit.
So at last Surgeon, killed by a fallen megalith, appears to have been disproved. But for Mike Pitts, this mysterious medieval man is no less intriguing for that.
I feel I've been on a journey with this man for more than half my life. Along with everybody else, I believed that he died when a megalith fell on him. Now, looking at the skeleton, it was obvious he hadn't been killed by the megalith. So we began with a legend, and I feel now that I have the story of a real man, an itinerant tailor, perhaps somebody who'd fought in battle early in his life, who died, we don't know how, but ended up ignominiously thrown into this pit with a megalith. Perhaps centuries later we can grant this man a respect that he certainly wasn't shown at the moment of his death.
Tales from an Unknown Soldier's Grave next Friday, same time, 8 o'clock. And you can unearth the mysteries of the dead by visiting our Bodies of Evidence website, where experts Anthea Boylston and Mike Pitts will be answering your questions in a few minutes. Just go to channel4.com/history. Next up, Tim's making a pig's ear out of his latest venture in Brookside.